Canada is entering a period that may radically change the entire logic of North American trade and energy policy. A country that for many years tried to balance between Washington and Beijing is now effectively beginning to build its own course, and the turning point has become the new debate over the possible removal of 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. What only recently seemed like an impossible scenario is now being discussed in economic circles as an option capable of rebooting Canadian industry. The deeper causes of this shift have been accumulating for years. The Canadian automotive sector has been slowly losing modernization momentum, facing chronic shortages of investment, dependence on imported batteries, and a lack of domestic rare earth materials. The main blow came with the shift to EVs. Production in Canada proved too expensive and available models too limited. According to Toronto research centers, the average EV price in Canada exceeds American and European equivalents by dozens of percent, while the domestic market increasingly demands affordable alternatives. Against these structural weaknesses, China saw an opportunity. Asian manufacturers have the world's largest battery supply chains, access to minerals, and fine-tuned technological platforms. Unlike Western companies, they can offer a fully integrated system, from refined lithium supplies to engineering solutions for modular batteries, and this set of advantages became the key topic of contacts between Ottawa and Beijing. The decisive moment came at the APEC summit in South Korea, where Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met China's President Xi Jinping formally. The sides discussed climate and resilient supply chains, but according to sources in international economic institutions, much of the negotiations focused specifically on the automotive sector and Canadian tariff policy. The Chinese delegation presented a concept of integrating Canada into an updated Asia-Pacific industrial cooperation format, access to battery components, long-term supplies of critical minerals, and the possibility of building joint ventures on Canadian soil. For Canada, this shift became impossible to ignore. The North American market has overheated due to tariffs, and dependence on U.S. manufacturers only increases pressure on the domestic economy. Discussing the possibility of removing some or all of the 100% tariffs emerged not from political motivation, but from objective necessity. Canadian industry cannot compete without inexpensive components and batteries. According to Montreal Research Institutes, this became the main driver behind the serious policy reassessment. According to Reuters, the Canadian government is already considering a model of step-by-step tariff easing for Chinese EVs. This approach would gradually open the market while maintaining political control over supply volumes and simultaneously modernizing domestic production capacity. Several provinces have already submitted proposals to host Chinese assembly lines, which could create thousands of jobs and boost infrastructure investment. For the U.S., these trends have become an unwelcome signal. The American tariff pressure model was built on the idea of completely isolating Chinese automakers from the North American market. But if Ottawa eases barriers, Chinese EVs will be able to enter the region while bypassing direct export routes to the U.S. Washington fears that Canada could become a transit hub, especially if Chinese manufacturers begin producing part of their models in Canada, creating legal grounds for shipments under regional agreements. The most serious consequences are emerging now as the discussion about removing the 100% tariffs moves beyond Canada's internal politics and begins to alarm Washington. In U.S. financial circles, there is growing recognition that potential liberalization of the Canadian market would create a fracture in the North American defensive architecture built against Chinese technologies. For the U.S., this is not simply about cheaper EVs appearing in a neighboring country. It is a threat of sector-wide redistribution in industries Washington has tried to keep under its control since the beginning of the trade war. According to analysts at the Wall Street Journal, experts in Washington are seriously considering a scenario in which China could use Canada as a strategic bypass that weakens the effect of U.S. tariffs. Canadian analysts note that even partial tariff removal places Chinese batteries and components directly next to the U.S. border. And if joint assembly sites appear in Canada, the country could, within a few years, certify EVs as North American under regional trade rules. For Washington, this effectively means losing control over a market that Trump tried to reinforce with tariffs. US industrial leaders understand the risks. Any Canadian movement toward China creates the possibility of a gray zone in which all USMCA rules are formally respected. But in practice, the US market receives products from China's technological ecosystem. According to Washington think tanks, this scenario has become a subject of closed consultations at the White House, where additional pressure on Ottawa is being discussed. Concerns extend beyond autos. Batteries, minerals, and energy components could also enter through new supply channels if Canadian policy shifts. At the same time, there is growing recognition that Canada is tired of being a hostage to America's tariff logic. Trump's tariff escalation against China hit not only Chinese exports, but also Canadian manufacturers that depended on Asian components. Canadian industry had relied on global supply chains for decades, and their abrupt disruption made many projects unprofitable. Industrial reports note that entire segments of Canadian factories stood idle due to component shortages, and production lines had to be mothballed. Against this economic backdrop, sentiment in Ottawa shifted quickly. Canada sees no reason to continue a strategy designed to protect the US market while harming Canadian businesses. Experts in the country increasingly argue that Trump's tariff war became not a tool of development, but a barrier to growth. As a result, removing the 100% tariffs is viewed not as a political gesture toward Beijing, but as an attempt to restore Canada's access to modern technologies and lower EV prices for its own population. Internal political research shows that Canadian society is tired of expensive EVs and an opaque tariff model that essentially shifts the cost of trade wars onto ordinary citizens. In this atmosphere, China's proposal does not look like external pressure but like a realistic alternative. And given that Chinese manufacturers control most of the global battery market, cooperation becomes not a political choice, but an economic necessity. For Washington, this creates a dangerous strategic combination. China gains a foothold in one of the key nodes of the North American economy, and Canada gains an opportunity to accelerate modernization. The US is left in a situation where tariffs stop working. Chinese technologies can enter the region through Canadian jurisdiction, making any isolation meaningless. The strategic conclusion becomes obvious. The cancellation of Canadian tariffs is not a local adjustment of trade policy, but a potential turning point for the entire North American economic architecture. And the key question remains whether Washington will be able to adapt to the new conditions, or whether the US is entering an era in which traditional pressure mechanisms no longer work, and China gradually forms a new industrial reality right on the northern border. The consequences of such a shift may turn out to be far deeper than they appear at first glance. The weakening of tariffs creates a new model of interaction within the region, where Canada gains access to technologies that have long been unavailable to Western markets, and China gains the ability to integrate into the North American framework, not through direct exports, but through the territory of the US's closest ally. This changes the very dynamic of competition. American automakers risk facing the arrival of much cheaper and more technologically advanced EVs produced to Chinese standards, but assembled at Canadian plants.